Everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric and a continuing series, Sega Race Renaissance, where we review every single arcade release 3D racing game Sega ever made in a retrospective fashion, and today we have the first one they ever did, Virtua Racing. Now we are going to be mixing this video between the M2 remake or port on the Switch and the original Model 1 arcade board, because honestly the de facto version you should play would be the M2 remake. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, down below hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But this is where it all starts. 3D racing for Sega on the Model 1. The use of the word Virtua to denote 3D games. You have Virtua Fighter, Virtua Tennis, Virtua Racing, Virtua Cop. Sega loved their Virtua. I don't know why they didn't put the L on the end, but that's just what they did. But honestly, this is just the advent of the genre that I love the most from Sega outside of light gun gaming, and that is 3D arcade racers. You'll see as we go back over to the Model 1 version, it looks very similar, but it only runs in 30 frames a second natively, and of course it's not as high of a resolution. M2 did a spectacular job at converting this game faithfully one-to-one as far as the handling and mechanics are concerned, and sprucing it up for a modern audience. But it's so wild to think that this game was just amazing when it released. I remember being a kid, and I remember two 3D games that impressed me in arcades because I hadn't really seen 3D. First was Hard Drivin', the second was Virtua Racing. Seeing this when it released in all its colorful glory, we had nothing like this at home. We were still playing Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, and some of us were probably still playing NES. And all of a sudden Sega put something like the Model 1 arcade hardware in arcades, and it's just mind-blowing. But I can't stress enough how good the M2 version of Virtua Racing is. There is no real need from outside of a historical standpoint to play the original Model 1 release. Now if you see a cabinet for it in the wild, 100% play it. They are not very common anymore. But if you've never played Virtua Racing and you want a version to pick, the remake is the one you want, because it is 100% faithful to the original driving mechanics, the original game. All it does is make things look prettier, and it runs in 60 frames versus 30 frames, and that is a super big benefit for this. And the interesting thing is that every single game we have talked about on this series so far, and every single game that we're going to talk about after this episode, comes from a common lineage, and that is Virtua Racing. Every 3D Sega game in the arcade racing genre has stemmed from this game, and that's how important it is. But it's not just fun to talk about from just a classic perspective, it also is a great game that has excellent handling mechanics and some really fun cutscenes. Because I know this looks janky today, even though it's been remade, because these models do not have very many polygons on them whatsoever, but when this was originally in arcades, this would blow your mind, and no one had ever seen anything quite like it before. This was the advent of an entire new generation, and interestingly in a moment, this game does something that I find really funny. Apparently physics do not exist outside of the cars, because this driver is going to throw his hat into the sky, and it's just going to continue to go. Legend has it, it's still up there somewhere flying into the universe. But you'll see starting at this level you have these pigeons as well, and they are in full 3D polygons. This game does not use any 2D outside of the heads-up display as far as I can tell. Even those palm trees right there, the leaves are made up of polygons. Sure, there's probably only like 4 or 5 to get that effect, but Sega drove home the 3D in Virtua Racing. They didn't want anything on the screen that was a 2D element, it seems. So what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to let you listen to the soundtrack, and I'm going to give you the original Model 1 version just so you have something different to look at. But this game doesn't have a soundtrack all the time. It has some music, and then it goes over to engine noises. So really what you're listening to is the sound effects of the game, because even though this is a classic historical example of Sega going 3D, the sound never really gets talked about, but it is quite good. So enjoy for 45 seconds, and I will be right back. It's interesting that the music isn't there all the time, and I'm not sure if that's just a technique to save on ROM storage space, because ROM chips were not cheap back in the day, or if it was a stylistic choice. But if you want some music in the game, I might suggest you put on Van Halen's Panama. That seems like a really good song to race around this game in. But I know we've talked a lot about the historical aspect of it, but let's get into the actual gameplay itself. This game has spectacular handling. When you're ripping around this track, if you make a mistake, it's because you screwed up. You need to be good to see the end of every single race because the timer is quite stringent on you. You make too many mistakes, you're just not going to see that checkered flag. But Sega just didn't get 3D down with this release. They got the understanding of how cars handle physics-wise in 3D, and that's been something that I've always said Sega's great at. Unfortunately, we didn't finish the race. We got 5th position there. Is the handling mechanics of these games themselves. All of the racing games have great handling, some better than others, but it depends on what type of car that you're actually using. I love that those women come out in bikinis with umbrellas. It's not raining, maybe they're worried about the sun. But this game has a ton of other camera options as well. And this one shows you the entire environment as you drive around the race course, and it has an RC car sort of feel, like when you were a kid and you had those little tracks where you would put the car in and they would be battery powered. You can play this game in so many different ways. It definitely changes the sense of speed, but it gives you something else to look at, and it really does seem like Sega wanted to show customers in arcades all the different ways 3D can be employed, because you can't do this on System 32 with sprite scaling. You can't just push a button and suddenly back the camera up. It's a 2D screen space with 2D elements, but in a full 3D engine with a virtual camera, you can put it wherever you want and give them a view, or if you want to, you can go directly into the cockpit, and they even spent the time to model the racer's hands so you could see how that wheel turns. It does jump around a little bit. It's not the smoothest thing, but the fact that this was the first time Sega had done it in 3D, I think it's spectacular, and I do love how the sense of speed increases even more in the cockpit view, and with this M2 remake getting up to 60 frames a second, how it feels even smoother and faster than the arcade original did. But what I really keep coming back to is just how good Sega did at the start. This was a new type of game for them. Sure, they had experience in racing games, but 3D with Model 1 was a new feature at Sega. And you have to remember, at a certain point in time, no developer knew how to work in 3D because 3D wasn't something that was developed for. There was an entire period in both the arcade and home console scene where developers who were comfortable with sprites and 2D games had to learn how to develop games in 3D, and there were a lot of growing pains in that period in time. Some games held up better than others, but the fact that Sega was able to make such a spectacular 3D racing game on Model 1 still astonishes me to this day, and I think that's why this entire retrospective exists. If Sega hadn't gotten it right on the start, they probably wouldn't have made as many arcade racing games, or maybe they wouldn't have been as good. But the direct lineage from the most recent Sega arcade racing game, World Drivers Championship, harkens all the way back to Virtua Racing on the Model 1. You have to get there from here. And again, just mechanically, I love the colors, I love the physics, I love the steering. Everything is a ton of fun. Of course, you don't get much of a selection for cars and you only get 3 tracks, but it probably took them an infinite amount of time to even get to this point in time because they were making it up as they were going along. This was brand new technology and brand new methods of working. But yeah, leave me a comment down below. Do you still play Virtua Racing? And if you haven't played it in a long time, I can't recommend enough the remake by M2. Sure, that I'll be back next Wednesday with more episodes in Sega Race Renaissance. And I'll have videos throughout the week as well. But yeah, Virtua Racing, it's where Sega got their start. See you guys next time. Bye-bye.